Welcome, everyone, to a brand new deep dive.
Really glad to be here today.
Yeah, it's going to be a big one. Listen, if you are somebody who is deeply interested in men's rights, or if you actively follow the complex conversations happening in the manosphere right now.
Or even if you're just trying to figure out what happened to our institutions.
Exactly. If you want to understand the historical shift in our modern institutions, how they operated before what many argue is their complete capture by feminist and Marxist ideologies, then you have absolutely found the right place.
This is definitely the deep dive tailored for you.
We are thrilled you're joining the conversation today. But hey, before we get going, please take a quick second to like and subscribe to the show. It helps us immensely and ensures you never miss these deep explorations.
And we have a truly monumental text to navigate today. I mean, the scope of what we are covering is just massive.
That is an understatement. Today's mission is a comprehensive, ultra-long, incisive, and honestly fascinating review of a highly provocative new ebook. It's making serious waves across the cultural landscape right now.
It really is.
We're talking about the book titled Rewarding Criminality, Evil Incentives of Lefty Restorative Justice. It's authored by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
And our goal today is to unpack this book's core thesis, which is sweeping, unapologetic, and guaranteed to challenge conventional narratives.
Absolutely. Riker basically argues that our modern institutions, from the family courts and the education system to media, healthcare, and the corporate workplace, have been entirely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Fundamentally altering the social contract to the severe detriment of men.
Right. And listen, if this sparks your interest at any point today, we strongly encourage you to buy this ebook. Read the full, unfiltered arguments for yourself. You can find it right now on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books.
And you should definitely follow the author at the handle @ConradRiker on Substack.
Yeah, at Conrad Ron Riker on Substack.
But before we delve into the specific statistics and arguments presented in the text, I need to step in and issue a very strict, crucial disclaimer for you, our listener.
Good call.
Because the source material we are covering today contains highly politically charged content regarding gender, feminism, social justice, and institutional bias, I want to make it explicitly clear that neither of us, as your hosts, are taking a side.
Right. We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. We are not endorsing the viewpoints presented in this book, whether they're perceived as left-wing, right-wing, or anywhere else on the political spectrum.
Our role here today is strictly and impartially to report, unpack, and synthesize the ideas, the data, and the arguments contained in Riker's original text.
We are holding up a mirror to the book so that you can fully understand the material and the profound perspective it represents.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker does not waste any time in the text. She dives straight into a complete deconstruction of what she calls the myth of patriarchy.
Yeah, she goes right for the foundational concepts.
She argues our understanding of history has been fundamentally subverted. To hear modern academia tell it, the patriarchy was a system of oppressive male dominance designed to keep women subjugated.
But Riker flips that entirely on its head.
She asserts it was actually a system of organized male self-sacrifice, duty, and protection. So how does she build that foundation?
Well, she builds it by looking at the concept of legal and moral liability. Riker argues that the concept of patriarchy has been linguistically weaponized by modern academics.
Weaponized how?
In traditional societies, she points out, the father, or the male leader, wasn't just sitting on a throne enjoying unearned privilege. He was the one legally, financially, and morally responsible for the family's actual survival.
Meaning, if the family starved, it was his failure.
Precisely. If the community was attacked, he was expected to stand at the front line and die. The text posits that this dynamic wasn't a form of privilege. It was a profound life-or-death liability.
So the authority men held was simply the necessary counterbalance to the immense burden of responsibility they carried.
Right, and that reframing really comes into sharp focus when she brings up the Titanic.
Oh man, the Titanic example. I think everyone knows the basic story of the ship sinking in 1912, but the statistics she highlights are chilling when viewed through this new lens.
They really are.
She points out that 80% of the men on that ship died, while only 24% of the women perished.
And she uses that stark disparity to directly attack the modern feminist narrative. Riker points out that the phrase, women and children first, was not some slogan invented by activists to expose a patriarchal hierarchy.
No, she views it as the ultimate expression of a moral code of civilized male self-sacrifice.
Exactly. These men, many of whom were the wealthiest and most powerful figures of their day, voluntarily stood on a sinking deck in freezing water so that women and children could take the lifeboats.
Raker argues that framing this historical reality as patriarchal oppression, where men supposedly held all the power and women were victims, is entirely absurd.
Because the men used their power to ensure their own demise so the women could live.
It really forces you to pause. I mean, if it was a true system of oppressive power, the men would have just taken the boats.
Yeah, they have the physical strength to do it. But she doesn't just stop at maritime disasters. She takes this same lens of male sacrifice and applies it to global warfare.
Specifically looking at the Battle of the Somme in 1916.
Right, the Somme is one of the bloodiest battles in human history, and Riker focuses on the staggering 57,470 British casualties that occurred in a single day.
Just think about the sheer scale of that carnage in one day.
The argument here is that these men were not walking into relentless machine gun fire and artillery shells to oppress women or to enforce a global patriarchy.
They were dying by the tens of thousands to stop tyranny, to protect their homelands, and to end human suffering.
Riker brings in Steven Pinker's work here, specifically The Better Angels of Our Nature, to support the idea that the historical decline in global violence was made possible by men's willingness to bleed and die to reduce it.
So male sacrifice, according to this text, is the actual engine of civilization's progress, not female victimhood.
Precisely.
And what about the building of the civilization itself? Because she leans heavily into the Industrial Revolution to make the same point about physical labor.
Oh, her critique of modern academia here is really striking.
She argues that feminist academics today sit in comfortable, climate-controlled universities and sneer at the era as being driven by toxic masculinity.
The cognitive dissonance she highlights is profound. The text reminds the reader that the Industrial Revolution, the very foundation of our modern comforts, was powered by men working grueling 80-hour weeks in pitch-black coal mines.
Inhaling coal dust that would eventually kill them.
Yeah. She brings up the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, too. This wasn't built by privileged overlords. It was built by men living in squalid tent camps, performing back-breaking labor.
She specifically mentions caisson disease in relation to the bridge builders.
By the bends.
Yeah. For those listening who might not be familiar with the term, caisson disease is a horrific, agonizing condition. These workers were digging the bridge's foundations deep underwater in pressurized boxes called caissons.
And when they came back up to the surface too quickly,
Nitrogen bubbles would form in their blood and tissues, cause excruciating joint pain, paralysis, and frequently death.
And Riker's point is that feminists today directly benefit from the hospitals, the paved roads, the bridges, and the universities that were literally built on the broken backs and the agonizing deaths of those men.
So to turn around and label the history of male labor as toxic or oppressive is, in her view, the ultimate historical betrayal.
What's fascinating here is how she connects these physical historical realities to what is happening in classrooms right now.
Right, if history was built on male sacrifice, why isn't it taught that way?
Exactly. And that leads us straight into her concept of the institutional capture of history. Riker argues that language and education are actively being weaponized to rewrite the past.
The goal, she asserts, is to systematically turn historical male sacrifice and achievement into a narrative of systemic oppression.
By doing this, the education system effectively removes male heroes from the curriculum and replaces them with an ideological framework that demonizes male ambition.
The data she pulls to support this is wild. She cites a study from the Brookings Institution, which found that a staggering 68% of public high schools now frame historical exploration not as a testament to human courage or achievement, but as male imperialism.
The specific examples in the book read almost like satire, but she insists they are real syllabi.
She discusses a university course that literally framed the Apollo 11 moon landing, Neil Armstrong's iconic "one small step for man," as a patriarchal assertion of dominance over the lunar feminine.
It is a perfect example of what she means by linguistic weaponization.
Yeah.
She points out the sheer absurdity of teaching college sophomores that a giant rock in space, the moon, is somehow gendered female.
And that landing a spacecraft on it constituted a violation by male presence.
It strips away the incredible engineering, the math, the bravery of sitting on top of a controlled explosion, and reduces it all to a gendered crime.
And she sees this exact same erasure happening at the state level,
Yeah.
specifically pointing to California's ethnic studies model curriculum that was rolled out in 2023.
According to the text, this curriculum intentionally erased historical navigators. Figures like Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, and Lewis and Clark were scrubbed.
Just gone.
Riker claims they weren't removed because their historical impacts were inaccurate or insignificant. They were erased because they were inconveniently male and didn't fit the new narrative.
In their place, she asserts, the curriculum highlighted fictionalized narratives of indigenous navigators who left behind no historical records, no written logs, and no evidence of transoceanic ships. Why does she think that swap is so dangerous for young students?
Because exploration, historically, required immense physical strength, stamina, and a willingness to face almost certain death. Traits that the book links deeply to male biology and risk-taking.
So by erasing the actual men who mapped the globe and replacing them with politically convenient fiction,
Riker argues the education system is sending a clear subliminal message to children. Male achievement is inherently tainted, and male heroes are not to be celebrated.
man, if the education system is systematically demoralizing boys by rewriting history, it begs the question, what is happening to those boys in real time within the walls of the school?
Which transitions us perfectly into the book's deep dive on the capture of psychological institutions.
And what Riker explicitly calls a war on masculinity.
This is where she takes aim at the very top of the mental health establishment. The text focuses heavily on the American Psychological Association.
The APA.
Yes, specifically analyzing their 2018 guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. Riker breaks down how these official guidelines to traditional masculine traits, things that have been necessary for survival for millennia, and abruptly labeled them as harmful.
Wait, what specific traits are we talking about here? What did the APA classify as harmful?
The guidelines specifically targeted traits like emotional restraint, stoicism, competitiveness, and a drive for independence.
Wow.
The APA tied these directly to the concept of toxic masculinity, suggesting that socializing boys to be strong, stoic providers causes psychological damage.
That is a massive paradigm shift. So she's arguing that the APA, an organization that just a few decades ago pathologized homosexuality, has now pivoted to treating traditional protective masculine behavior as a dangerous mental disorder that needs to be therapeutically cured.
That is precisely her argument, and she provides some genuinely shocking real-world anecdotes to illustrate how this top-down psychological guidance trickles down into local classrooms.
She details an incident from 2019 involving a 10-year-old boy in an Oregon public school.
Right, like millions of boys. He liked action figures, he liked Star Wars, and he was drawing in class.
He sketched a picture of a soldier holding a gun.
And the school's response was to suspend him, claiming his drawing violated their safe space rules and showed troubling signs of aggression.
A 10-year-old drawing a soldier gets suspended, but she contrasts that with another event in the same district, right?
She does. In that exact same week, within the same school district, a 12-year-old girl participated in a school event where she recited a violent, emotionally charged slam poem titled, "I Hope My Rapist Dies."
Whoa. And what was the school's reaction to that?
According to Riker, she faced no discipline, no mandatory counseling, and no suspension. Instead, she received cheers from the staff for finding her voice.
The contrast is unbelievable.
Riker uses this stark contrast to highlight what she views as a glaring, institutionalized double standard. Male energy, even when expressed through a harmless doodle of a hero, is aggressively policed and punished.
Meanwhile, female aggression and trauma dumping are celebrated as stunning bravery and empowerment.
Exactly.
So the system is telling boys that their natural inclinations are dangerous. How does that impact their actual academic performance? Does she have data on the fallout?
She relies on a very revealing, somewhat quiet 2022 study out of MIT. The researchers looked at male students in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math.
And what did they find?
The study found that when male students were explicitly told in orientations or by administration that they were overrepresented in these fields, their GPAs subsequently dropped by an average of 0.4 points in a single semester.
A nearly half-point GPA drop just from being told there are too many of them? How does she interpret the mechanics of that drop?
Riker's conclusion is that telling a young man he doesn't belong, or that his very demographic presence is a problem to be solved by diversity initiatives, actively demoralizes him.
It destroys his drive.
The system, she argues, isn't just ignoring boys. It is sending them a daily institutional message that they are unwanted, resulting in massive academic disengagement.
And when you disengage a massive population of young men, the consequences go far beyond grades. Riker ties this academic demoralization directly to a devastating mental health crisis,
She brings up the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data.
noting that men commit suicide at a rate 3.5 times higher than women.
It is a staggering statistic, and Riker is furious at the institutional response to it. She notes that despite men making up nearly 80% of all suicides, the public health apparatus continues to fund massive women's wellness programs,
while essentially blaming male suicide on men themselves.
claiming they die because of toxic masculinity or their stubborn refusal to talk about their feelings.
She really goes after the Scandinavian model here, which I found fascinating because countries like Sweden and Finland are constantly held up in the media as utopias.
They are the promised land of feminism, gender equality, and social safety nets.
Yet, as Riker points out, those very countries have some of the highest male suicide rates in the developed world.
This is a crucial part of her argument. She posits that in these highly feminized, egalitarian societies, men are not dying from an excess of toxic masculinity.
They are dying from a profound, crushing lack of purpose combined with constant societal gaslighting. What does she mean by societal gaslighting in this context?
She means that when men are told from birth that their biology is a social disease and that their traditional, hardwired roles as protectors, builders, and providers are outdated, toxic, and unnecessary, the inevitable result is despair.
Riker aggressively rejects the modern therapeutic idea that men just need to cry more to be healthy.
The text argues that men do not need to be feminized. They need respect, they need to carry responsibility, and they need recognition for their burdens.
These are the very things the current system actively denies them. So what does this all mean when we look at the environment where boys spend most of their waking hours? The education system itself.
Riker points straight to the demographics. Currently, 76% of teachers in the United States are female. When you look at elementary schools, that number shoots up to 89%.
Meaning boys are essentially spending their entire formative years, emotionally, socially, and academically, in an entirely female-dominated environment.
Precisely. And Riker argues this demographic reality creates a pedagogical style that inherently punishes male energy.
Because the modern classroom expects children to sit perfectly still for 8 hours.
To verbalize their feelings constantly, and to strictly avoid rough and tumble play.
When boys naturally fail to conform to this female-centric behavioral model because their biology demands movement and competition, they are quickly pathologized.
They are medicated for ADHD, or labeled as disruptive problems. Riker asserts that this hostile environment is the direct cause of boys dropping out, disengaging, and abandoning the educational pipeline in record numbers.
If the education system is demoralizing boys and punishing their nature, as Riker claims, we have to look at what happens when those boys grow up, enter the workforce, and try to form their own families.
Which leads us straight into one of the most provocative and incendiary sections of her entire book.
The concept she terms the marriage plantation, and what she describes as the systemic feminist war on fatherhood.
The terminology she uses, the marriage plantation, is obviously designed to shock, but she uses it to describe a very specific economic dynamic.
The text argues that the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 1970s was sold to the public as a necessary form of liberation.
But in practice, Riker asserts, it created a system where men act as sharecroppers and the family courts act as the overseers.
Sharecroppers. Can you break down how she justifies that comparison?
She argues that marriage, under current family law, has devolved into a one-way financial instrument. Men are expected to provide the capital and fund a lifestyle for a family, but they can be legally excluded from that family at any moment for no reason while still being forced to fund it.
The financial and custody disparities she cites to back this up are monumental. Looking at the data she pulls from the Congressional Budget Office, she notes that men currently pay 92% of all alimony and 70% of all child support.
Combine that with the National Father's Day Council data showing mothers receive primary physical custody in 80% of all divorces.
And Riker is quick to dismiss the common counterargument that these numbers exist simply because children naturally prefer mothers or because mothers are inherently better parents.
She argues these disparities exist because the family court system operates on a deeply entrenched feminist dogma of maternal presumption, treating fathers as secondary parents whose primary utility is financial.
To really drive home the financial extremity of this system, she details a specific case from 2015 involving a software engineer in New Jersey. I had to read this section twice because the numbers were so staggering.
It's a brutal case study.
This father had 50-50 legal and physical custody of his children, meaning he was doing half the parenting. Yet the judge ordered him to pay his ex-wife $18,000 a month in child support.
It is an incredible sum. And what outraged Riker the most was the judge's justification. According to the text, the judge stated the massive payment was necessary, in part, to compensate the ex-wife for her emotional labor during the marriage.
How does a judge even quantify emotional labor in a legal setting? What does that even mean in this context?
That is exactly Riker's point of contention. She argues that emotional labor is an entirely subjective concept invented by feminist sociologists with zero empirical basis.
It has no place in contract law.
Yet she claims it is being weaponized in family courts to extract exorbitant wealth from men who committed no crime, who simply want to raise their children, and who are already splitting the parenting time evenly.
As intense as the alimony discussion is, the book gets even darker when it tackles what Riker calls the cuckoldry conspiracy.
She cites a 2005 meta-analysis conducted by Dr. Martin A. Bellis, which looked at data across 20 different countries.
And finding.
The findings suggested that between 1% and 3% of all children are currently being raised by men who are not their biological fathers and who are entirely unaware of this fact.
1 to 3% might sound small on a percentage basis, but globally, we are talking about millions of men.
Riker equates this to hundreds of thousands of men being turned into involuntary financial sponsors based on a fundamental, life-altering deception.
And her outrage isn't just directed at the infidelity itself, it is laser focused on the legal system's active protection of that deception. She points out that in countries like France, private paternity testing is literally illegal. You can face jail time for trying to verify if your child is biologically yours without a court order.
That is terrifying. What happens when a man does find out? She mentions cases in Texas and California, right?
Yes, she highlights multiple cases where men discovered, sometimes years later through medical DNA testing, that the children they had been loving and paying support for were not biologically theirs.
And when they went to court.
When these men petitioned the courts to end the mandated financial payments because they were victims of fraud, the courts denied their petitions. The judges cited the best interest of the child doctrine, forcing the men to continue paying.
So a man is lied to, finds out he's not the father, and the state still forces him to pay for another man's biological child.
Exactly. Riker vehemently argues that forcing a man to fund the product of his wife's infidelity is institutionalized misandry,
She calls it the legalization of fraud.
where the court system treats the man merely as a utility, a wallet, rather than a human being with fundamental rights to consent and truth.
If the courts are making it this legally perilous for men to marry and have children, what is the macro effect on society?
Riker zooms out and asserts that these exact policies are the primary driver behind the collapse of the nuclear family.
She argues that the welfare state has essentially stepped in to replace the husband. The government acts as the default father.
She points to policies like the expanded child tax credit, arguing that these financial incentives actively encourage out-of-wedlock births.
She cites data showing a 7.3% increase in such births in high welfare states following expansions of these programs.
Her core argument is that the state financially rewards women for excluding men from the family unit, making fathers economically redundant.
And the outcomes for the children in these fatherless homes are tragic. She brings in a University of Toronto study finding that boys raised without fathers in the home are 3.2 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD.
Furthermore, Department of Justice data shows they are 5 times more likely to end up in prison.
Riker's analysis of those tragic outcomes is incredibly cynical regarding institutional motives.
Very much so. She argues that the feminist establishment does not mourn this epidemic of fatherlessness. On the contrary, she claims they rely on it.
A generation of broken, fatherless children requires more government intervention, more social workers, more therapists, and more state funding.
Which massively expands the power and budget of female-dominated social institutions.
So, who is organizing this? I mean, who does Riker believe is actually orchestrating these legal and cultural shifts against fatherhood? It doesn't just happen by accident.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, she points directly at a global network of feminist NGOs and international bodies.
The book names organizations like the UK's Refuge and even the United Nations entity UN Women.
Riker alleges that these groups spend millions of dollars in lobbying efforts specifically to block shared parenting laws. Whenever a state or country tries to pass a law making 50-50 custody the default, she claims these organizations fight it tooth and nail.
Why would organizations supposedly dedicated to family welfare fight equal parenting?
Riker argues that their ultimate goal is not child welfare, but regime change. By blocking shared parenting, they maintain unilateral female power over the family unit.
The goal is to dismantle traditional family structures to ensure men remain legally and financially subjugated to women's choices.
That theme of systemic institutional bias seamlessly transitions us into the fourth major section of her text.
The overarching concept of the gynocracy.
Right. Riker claims that these biases are not isolated to the courts. They are deeply, inextricably embedded in law enforcement, the healthcare system, and the corporate workplace.
The grand unified theory here is that modern society universally prioritizes female safety and comfort over male survival.
Let's start with how she applies this to law enforcement. Riker fiercely critiques the Violence Against Women Act, commonly known as VI Way.
This is a massive piece of federal legislation passed in the 1990s.
The book claims VI Way was heavily crafted by feminist NGOs and is fundamentally built on the ideological premise that men are default perpetrators and women are eternal victims.
Let's break down how that ideology actually functions on the ground. She points specifically to mandatory arrest policies funded by VI grants, right?
Yes, in many jurisdictions, if police are called to a domestic dispute, mandatory arrest policies dictate that the officer must arrest someone.
And Riker argues the framework encourages arresting the man.
This can happen even if there is no physical evidence of abuse, and even if the woman explicitly denies that an assault occurred.
The text argues that this entirely destroys the bedrock legal principle of the presumption of innocence, replacing it with an assumption of male guilt.
And she ties this directly to the broader cultural impact of the Believe All Women movement. Riker argues this slogan hasn't just captured social media, it has completely captured the justice system.
She details the profound danger of false allegations, dedicating significant space to argue that they are not rare anomalies as often claimed.
But a weaponized strategy used in divorces and on college campuses to destroy male rivals or extract settlements.
She references the Ronald Sullivan case to highlight this. For context, Ronald Sullivan is a brilliant Harvard law professor who made a career defending unpopular clients.
He was ousted from his role as a faculty dean after student protests because he joined the legal defense team for Harvey Weinstein.
But Riker also brings up cases where the accusations themselves were entirely fabricated, like the infamous Rolling Stone UVA article.
The Rolling Stone article, titled "A Rape on Campus," is a pivotal example for her. It detailed a horrific cinematic gang rape at a University of Virginia fraternity. It caused national outrage.
But it was published without basic journalistic corroboration, and was later proven to be completely fabricated. The alleged victim had invented the entire story.
Yet, as Riker points out, the lives of the accused fraternity members were ruined in the interim. They faced national humiliation, threats, and campus tribunals before the truth came out.
What is her ultimate takeaway from these high-profile failures of due process?
The author's point is that the modern feminist inquisitorial system demands instant male guilt. The text argues that while Believe All Women sounds like a compassionate call for empathy, in practice it is a dangerous authoritarian doctrine.
It erases due process, rewards lying by granting social status to accusers, and willingly sacrifices innocent men just to maintain the ideological narrative that women are perpetually in danger from male violence.
Riker then shifts this lens of the gynocracy from the justice system to the modern workplace, drawing a massive, uncomfortable contrast between male and female labor realities.
She pulls a snark statistic from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Men account for 93% of all workplace fatalities.
93%. Men are the ones dying in collapses in the mines, being crushed on logging sites, falling from scaffolding in construction, and drowning on commercial fishing boats. It is a brutal reality of physical labor.
And she contrasts that bloody reality with the modern feminized corporate culture, specifically aiming her critique at the post-COVID remote work era.
The text claims that in the modern tech and corporate sectors, women occupy 78% of the remote work slots.
They are safely collaborating via Zoom from their living rooms, insulated from physical risk, and even the stress of a commute.
Meanwhile, she argues, men are disproportionately required to stay on site, maintaining the physical servers, the electrical grids, and the logistical infrastructure that makes remote work possible.
Her fury regarding the media's coverage of this dynamic is palpable. She points out the insane disparity in what generates cultural outrage.
The media will run endless think pieces about a woman feeling microaggressed by an overly direct email, or facing imposter syndrome in a board meeting.
But there is absolute media silence when 29 male miners suffocate in a mountain collapse in West Virginia.
It perfectly encapsulates her theory of the gynocracy. She argues that this contrast proves society views male death as mere background noise, just the acceptable cost of doing business to keep the lights on.
But female discomfort, even at the level of an impolite email, is treated as a five-alarm national emergency requiring HR interventions and systemic overhauls.
That exact same dynamic of funding and attention is what she sees happening in the healthcare system, which she outright describes as a massive scam.
The funding disparities she highlights are hard to ignore. She notes that the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, spends $3.2 billion annually on women's health research.
By contrast, they spend only $1.1 billion on men's health research.
A 3-to-1 funding ratio in favor of women. But the mortality outcomes are the exact opposite.
Exactly. CDC data shows that men die 5.4 years earlier on average than women. Men account for nearly 80% of all suicides. Men are far more likely to die from heart disease and workplace accidents.
Yet they receive a fraction of the federal research funding.
Riker argues that men's health is treated as an afterthought simply because male pain lacks the political and cultural capital of women's issues.
We also have to address one of the most controversial, explosive stances in her book, her perspective on abortion.
She frames what she calls the abortion pandemic as the ultimate, inescapable expression of unilateral female power and systemic misandry.
It is a radically different framing of the issue. Riker argues that modern women demand absolute equality in pay, in the boardroom, and in shared domestic responsibilities.
Yet when it comes to the creation of human life, they demand absolute, unchecked, unilateral control.
She points out that men have zero legal say in whether a child they helped conceive is born, nor do they have any legal ability to opt out of forced fatherhood and decades of child support at the point of conception, often referred to as a paper abortion.
She pulls no punches here. She references the horrific Kermit Gosnell case.
Gosnell was a Philadelphia clinic operator who was convicted of murdering live-born infants in a squalid, dangerous facility.
Riker argues that the feminist establishment largely ignored the atrocity for years because acknowledging the horrors inside that clinic threatened the political sanctity of unrestricted abortion access.
Furthermore, she cites World Health Organization data claiming 73.3 million abortions happen globally every single year.
Riker argues that this industrial-scale procedure is normalized entirely because society silently accepts a deeply misandrous premise that men are not allowed to grieve the children they will never know.
She frames the systematic exclusion of fathers from the life or death fate of their own offspring as the single greatest act of institutional misandry in history. Here's where it gets really interesting. She takes all of this, the workplace fatality disparities, the skewed health funding, the education gaps, the legal subjugation in family courts, and traces it back to the highest levels of corporate and federal policy.
Specifically, she targets Title IX and corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion quotas.
Riker argues that these policies intentionally and systematically sacrifice male excellence, safety, and merit in order to meet ideological gynocentric goals.
She points to an alleged incident at NASA where an entire cohort of highly qualified astronaut trainees was supposedly scrapped because it was all male.
Despite their thousands of hours of flight experience and engineering degrees, she claims they were replaced by candidates who possessed gender studies degrees simply to fulfill a diversity quota.
Whether that specific NASA anecdote is fully accurate or a composite of DEI practices, her underlying thesis is clear.
She views these diversity initiatives not as an attempt to level the playing field, but as a hostile restructuring of society.
Is a system where raw competence and merit are replaced by compliance to feminist dogma, and where highly capable men are systematically demoted, sidelined, or entirely excluded to artificially elevate women who did not earn the position through equal labor or risk.
Which brings us to the fifth major section of the book, the media's misandry machine and the attack on free speech.
Riker believes that the media, massive tech monopolies, and even our most ancient religious institutions are actively manipulating the cultural narrative to normalize hatred against men.
Let's look at how she analyzes media tropes, because this is something everyone sees in their living rooms every day. She looks specifically at the evolution of the television father figure.
It is a very measurable cultural shift. The author notes that in 1995, 54% of TV dads were portrayed as bumbling, incompetent, or the butt of the joke.
By 2021, that number had surged to 78%.
She names iconic modern characters like Peter Griffin from Family Guy and Phil Dunphy from Modern Family.
Some might just say that's lazy sitcom writing, but she sees something much more insidious, right?
Yes, she argues this isn't just a quest for cheap laughs. It is a deliberate, coordinated effort by increasingly female-dominated writers' rooms and network executives to erode male confidence.
By constantly portraying the father as an idiot who needs to be saved or managed by his hyper-competent wife, the media destabilizes the image of fatherhood and conditioned society, especially children, to view male authority as inherently ridiculous and unnecessary.
And that subtle cultural conditioning is paired with overt, hard censorship by big tech. She details some severe claims regarding how platforms moderate speech.
The author discusses how Reddit, one of the largest discussion platforms in the world, outright banned the popular men's rights forum.
They labeled it a hate group for discussing the very statistics we are covering today: suicide rates, family court bias, workplace deaths.
Yet Raker alleges the exact same platform allows radical feminist forums to freely operate and repeatedly post trending hashtags like "kill all men with zero moderation or penalties."
She also brings up the firing of James Damore at Google, which was a massive cultural flashpoint a few years ago.
Damore wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed, mainstream biological and psychological studies on sex differences to explain why there might not be a 50-50 gender split in elite coding roles.
And he was immediately fired. Riker argues he wasn't fired for being wrong or for harassing anyone. He was fired for committing the unpardonable modern corporate crime of questioning feminist dogma with hard data.
She extends this critique beyond corporate America to international free speech laws, noting instances in the United Kingdom that sound almost dystopian.
The UK has incredibly strict communications laws, and Riker notes instances where British men have literally been arrested by police, had their electronics seized, and faced court dates simply for tweeting factual statements about biological sex.
Meanwhile, she points out, feminist accounts in the UK can trend misandrist hate speech and face absolutely no police scrutiny.
The text argues that free speech is effectively dead in the West if the law only applies to protecting one gender's feelings from offense.
She asserts that tech platforms and governments have weaponized subjective terms like hate speech to silence any man who dares articulate male pain or point out systemic feminist hypocrisy.
And the capture she describes isn't just secular. It has infiltrated the sacred as well.
The book claims this ideology has successfully hijacked modern religion. She shares an incredible anecdote about a mainstream Protestant pastor in Massachusetts.
It is a striking visual. According to Riker, this pastor stood before his congregation during a Sunday service, took a Bible, and actually burned a specific verse, Ephesians 5.22, which discusses wives submitting to husbands in order to appease modern feminist theology.
And the crowd cheered, a pastor burning the Bible to appease feminists.
This raises an important question, as the text asks. How does a society function? How does it maintain any cohesion when its primary communication platforms and its foundational moral institutions actively suppress and demonize the viewpoints of half the population?
The demographic fallout in the church is undeniable. The book notes that men now make up only 38% of regular churchgoers in the West.
Riker argues that men are abandoning the pews because they are fleeing hostile environments. They do not want to attend a church that demands they repent for historical male sin or toxic masculinity.
Furthermore, she criticizes the modern theological trend of rebranding God the Father into a genderless or maternal entity merely to avoid triggering patriarchy panics among the congregation.
The text claims the modern church is actively alienating the very men who historically built, funded, and literally fought to defend it.
The picture Riker paints across these hundreds of pages is one of total, suffocating institutional capture. It can feel incredibly bleak.
But the book doesn't end on a note of pure despair or nihilism.
Which leads us to the final body section of the text, restoring masculine order. Riker outlines proposed solutions for you, the listener, emphasizing the absolute necessity of pushing back against this system.
While she is highly critical of the status quo, she does highlight real-world solutions from around the globe that she believes actually work to support men's nature rather than pathologize it. For example, she points to Denmark's Man Lab program.
What exactly is the Man Lab?
It was a social program that took a different approach to male aggression and domestic strife. Instead of forcing men into feminist-led therapy to deconstruct their toxic traits, the program taught practical, tangible skills like financial budgeting, home repair, and direct conflict resolution.
And the result?
A 44% drop in domestic conflict among participants. Riker praises this model because it treats men as capable, pragmatic individuals who just need better tools, rather than treating them as broken oppressors who need to be emotionally neutered.
She also applauds Australia's men's sheds movement, which I think is a brilliant concept.
It is deeply grounded in male psychology. These are community-funded workshops where men can gather, use tools, build furniture or repair engines, and talk shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face.
Riker cites data showing that in regions where these sheds are active, male suicide rates dropped by a massive 31%.
It proves her point that male-centric spaces and physical brotherhood are absolutely essential for male mental health, and that forced integration or isolation is deadly.
She also looks at national policy, praising Hungary's aggressive tax incentives. Hungary implemented policies that heavily reward family formation and offer massive tax breaks for couples who marry and have children.
She contrasts this with Western welfare policies that she claims financially penalize marriage and incentivize single motherhood.
Building on those international successes, Riker concludes the book with a concrete, sweeping manifesto. She calls it the 10-point men's rights agenda.
This agenda is not a request for compromise. It is a direct political counterattack on the institutional policies she criticized throughout the text.
Let's run through these demands because they represent a total overhaul of the system. First, she demands making shared 50-50 parenting the absolute legal default in every divorce, removing the maternal presumption entirely.
Second, she calls for the absolute, unquestionable legal right to mandatory paternity testing at birth for every child, ending the cuckoldry conspiracy and fraud.
Third, she demands strict parity in federal health funding. If men die 5 years earlier and commit 80% of suicides, the NIH must allocate funding proportionately to combat the male health and workplace fatality epidemics.
Fourth, the state-funded creation of men's domestic violence shelters, acknowledging that male victims exist and currently have nowhere to go.
Fifth, she demands sweeping divorce reform to end the marriage plantation economics of lifelong alimony, limiting it to short-term rehabilitation only.
Sixth, and this one is huge, she calls for severe, mandatory legal and financial penalties for women who make false abuse allegations in family court or on college campuses, treating false accusations as the life-destroying perjury they are.
Seventh, implementing Hungarian-style tax incentives that specifically reward active fatherhood and intact nuclear families.
Eighth, the creation of a federal male education task force designed to specifically address the boys' crisis in schools, revamping curriculums to allow for male energy and bringing back male-centric history.
Ninth, the immediate repeal of gynocentric laws, like the current iteration of Veiwe, replacing them with gender-neutral domestic violence frameworks that do not assume male guilt.
And 10th, the establishment of a federally recognized Men's Day, designed not as a joke, but to sincerely honor male sacrifice, historical achievement, and the physical labor that sustains the nation.
Riker's ultimate call to arms is intense, fiery, and unapologetic. The book demands that men completely stop apologizing for their nature.
It urges men to wake up, to reclaim their historical roles as protectors, builders, and leaders.
Most importantly, she demands that men absolutely refuse to participate in a system that gladly extracts their labor, their taxes, and their physical safety, while simultaneously and systematically denying them their dignity, their children, and their voice.
The author's final, synthesizing thought is a warning. She claims the West is decaying not from external enemies or foreign armies, but from an internal betrayal by a gynocracy that has demonized the very men who built the civilization in the first place.
The book asserts that restoring masculine order, unapologetically, is the only possible way to pull society back from the brink of total demographic and cultural collapse. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into this incredibly dense, challenging, and provocative text. We've taken an intense journey through Sophie Marie Eve Riker's perspective on the systemic feminist capture of history, the education system, law enforcement, family courts, and the modern media landscape.
We've unpacked her explosive claims regarding the myth of patriarchy, the economics of the marriage plantation, the tragedy of the abortion pandemic, and the ongoing war on masculinity.
As we promised at the start, this text offers a radical, unfiltered, and deeply controversial look at the core grievances and the worldview held by many within the manosphere and the broader men's rights movement.
It is a text that relentlessly challenges the prevailing cultural narratives at every single turn. And as we conclude our analysis today, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, provocative thought inspired by the deep historical and societal claims made in this book.
Go for it.
If civilization was truly built on the shock absorbers of male sacrifice, as Riker passionately claims, if men have historically done the dying in the wars and the dying in the mines to build the modern world we take for granted, what happens to the infrastructure, the economy, and the very safety of a society if an entire generation of men simply decides to walk away from the social contract?
If the institutions refuse to honor that sacrifice, what is the ultimate catastrophic cost of a total male withdrawal?
It's a heavy question.
A heavy, fascinating, and perhaps terrifying question to ponder as we look at the future of our institutions. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this extensive exploration today.
Please do not forget to like and subscribe to the show. It means the world to us and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives.
And if the concepts, the data, and the arguments we discussed today sparked your interest, we highly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the featured ebook, Rewarding Criminality, Evil Incentives of Lefty Restorative Justice.
It is a read you won't forget. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad N. Riker at Substack for more ongoing unfiltered content.
Until next time, keep questioning the narratives, keep learning, and thank you for diving deep with us today.